The lobby of Crestline Tower gleamed under recessed light, packed with 47 of the deadliest men money could hire, former Navy SEALs, in tailored black retired FBI agents, with quiet eyes, UFC veterans with knuckles carved from stone. The elevator chimed. Caleb Merritt stepped out in a creased flannel shirt and worn boots, his 5-year-old son pressed to his hip, a stuffed bear under one small arm. A snort. A laugh. The whole room cracking open with it. Hallmark Dad Daycare's downstairs. Bring the bear champ. He looks meaner than you. Caleb did not turn his head. He knelt, fixed the boy's collar with careful hands, stood, and walked onto the mat without a word. 22 seconds later, Marcus Holt, national MMA champion, lay face down on the canvas and did not move. The lobby went still. And on a screen 32 floors above, a woman watched the replay, once then reached for her coat. 3 hours earlier, the city was still gray. Crestline Tower rose 48 stories above downtown Seattle, its glass face catching the dawn in long vertical streaks. Inside on the 32nd floor, Sloane Whitfield stood at the window of her corner office, with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a manila folder in the other. The folder had arrived 3 days earlier. No return address, no courier signature slipped past 2 layers of security and onto her desk, by a hand no camera had caught. 15 pages. A photograph of a younger man in a faded jacket holding a child at the shoulder. A service record with half the lines blacked out. A list of operations she did not have the clearance to know about. And one final line typed in plain font at the bottom of the last page. You will need him. She had read it twice on the first night. By the third night, she could recite it from memory. Ardenvale was the largest enterprise security firm on the West Coast. It guarded the data of more than 1,200 Fortune-class clients. In 11 days, on the morning of the fourth quarter board review, every name on its server architecture would be in the hands of whoever sat in her chair. Sloane had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 2 months. She closed the folder, set down her coffee, and rode the private elevator down to the 18th floor. The training floor had been cleared the day before. 47 men were already filling the staging hall, wide shoulders, in pressed jackets, the dull confidence of men who had been the most dangerous person in every room for the last 15 years. They moved like a single organism, sizing each other up by the way they held their coffee. Some carried leather portfolios. 2 carried framed commendations. One had brought his agency badge in a small velvet box. The elevator at the far end of the hall chimed. Caleb Merritt stepped out with his son on his hip, a paper envelope in his free hand, and the look of a man who had already counted every exit on the floor before the doors finished opening. Noah had Scout pressed against his shoulder, eyes wide but unafraid. The reaction was immediate. A few candidates glanced, dismissed, looked away. Others did not bother to hide the smirk. A heavy man near the registration table. Marcus Holt, 264 pounds of championship muscle wrapped in a custom track jacket, laughed loud enough to carry. Yo, Hallmark Dad. Daycare's on the first floor. Caleb did not answer. He set Noah down, gently knelt to fix the boy's collar, and stood. He walked to the registration table and laid the envelope on the surface. The intake officer, a woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a clipboard, opened it, read the single line inside, and dialed a number on her desk phone without looking up. She listened for 11 seconds. She nodded once. She handed Caleb a number badge marked 23. Behind her on the mezzanine balcony above the hall, Derek Calloway watched the whole exchange. He had been director of security at Ardenvale for 6 years. He had run the candidate filter himself. He had personally signed off on every name that walked through the door that morning. Caleb Merritt's name wasn't on his list. His jaw tightened a quarter inch. He turned and walked back to the bracket board on the corner wall. The bracket was supposed to be drawn by random algorithm 40 minutes before the first physical round. Derek pulled the chip card out of the slot, opened the override panel, with a code only 3 men in the building knew, and adjusted 2 slots by hand. By the time the screen finished, refreshing, Candidate 23 was paired against Candidate 1. Caleb against Marcus. The first phase was not the fight. The first phase was the threat assessment. The candidates were brought into a darkened conference room in groups of 8. A 90-second clip played on the wall, a crowded street market, a delegation of executives walking through the crowd, surveillance angles cycling. Each man had to identify on a touchscreen every potential threat point in the frame. The men in Caleb's group worked the screen with practiced fingers. The clip played twice. The grading panel at the front of the room logged the scores in real time. The highest belonged to a former Secret Service agent, who marked 5 of the 8 tagged threats. Above average. When it was Caleb's turn, the moderator gave the standard prompt. Identify the threats. Caleb did not touch the screen. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke quietly enough that the men in the back leaned forward. 8 tagged. The car at the second intersection. The bag under the vendor stall. The man on the rooftop in the blue cap. The woman at the second floor window. The package on the bench. The delivery scooter parked against traffic. The second man with the backpack at the south crosswalk. The gap in the fence behind the kiosk. The moderator's stylus stopped moving. You missed 2. Caleb shook his head once. You missed 2. The northeast camera has a dead angle from 41 degrees to about 70. Anyone standing in that wedge does not exist on your feed. Second, the man in the gray hat at the back of the crowd switched the duffel from his right hand to his left 4 times in 90 seconds. People do not do that unless the weight inside the bag is awkward or unless they are timing a pickup. Either way, he is your 10th threat. The room was very quiet for several seconds. Behind the one-way glass at the back, Derek Calloway kept his face still. Lucky guess, he muttered to no one. The technician next to him did not answer. On the 32nd floor, Sloan was watching the same feed on a second monitor while pretending to read a quarterly forecast. Her assistant Madison stood in the doorway with a stack of files. He doesn't fit the profile, ma'am. No, he doesn't. Sloan stood and reached for her coat. The fight was held in a converted training space that smelled faintly of clean rubber and old sweat. The mat was 12 meters square, 2 referees, 1 ringside medic. 46 candidates stood along the rope arms, crossed waiting to see how long the flannel shirt dad would last. Marcus Holt walked onto the mat, the way men with nothing to prove walk slow loose, almost bored. He cracked his neck. He smiled at someone in the front row. The ref signaled. Caleb stepped onto the mat without looking at the crowd. He did not raise his hands. For the first 3 seconds, Marcus circled. He led with a feint, a probing left, the kind of move that usually got an opponent's hands up so he could read their guard. Caleb did not lift his hands. Marcus tried again. Same result. By second 7, Marcus had stopped smiling. By second 12, he had thrown 2 real strikes, both of which slid past Caleb's shoulder by the width of a coin. Caleb was not blocking. He was not even moving much. He simply wasn't where the strikes were going. By the end of the first 18 seconds, Marcus had spent more energy than most fights cost him in a full round, and Caleb had not thrown a single punch. The crowd along the rope had gone from amused to confused to silent. What no one in that room could see, what only Caleb saw, was that Marcus Holt always rolled his weight onto the ball of his right foot a quarter second before he committed his hips. Every time. Once on the feint at second 4, again at second 9, again at second 16. On second 19, Marcus rolled onto his right foot. Caleb stepped in. He did not punch. He hooked his left hand under Marcus's lead arm, dropped his hips below the line of the larger man's center of gravity, and let Marcus's own forward weight take his feet out from under him. There was a sound, half thump, half exhale, and the championship belt holder landed face down on the mat, with one arm pinned at an angle that did not allow him to get up. He did not try. 22 seconds. Caleb stood, stepped off the mat, and walked over to the rope where Noah was sitting on a folding chair next to the medic scout in his lap. He knelt down to the boy's eye level. "You okay, bud?" Noah nodded. "Want to find some orange juice?" Noah nodded again. Caleb's breathing had not changed. The doors at the far end of the room opened, and Sloane Whitfield walked in. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Marcus, who was finally being helped to his feet by 2 trainers. She did not look at Derek, who had stepped down from the balcony 5 seconds too late, and was now standing very still by the bracket board. She walked the length of the room and stopped a respectful 3 steps from Caleb. He stood up from his crouch, but kept one hand on Noah's shoulder. "Mr. Merritt." Her voice carried, but only just. "Ma'am, come up to the 32nd floor. Bring your son." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked back to the doors. Caleb looked down at Noah, who was watching him with the patient, measuring eyes of a child used to changes in plan. "Looks like we're going up," he said quietly. The contract was already on the desk when they arrived. Sloane handed it to him without a word. 2 pages. Salary scope term. Caleb read it once. He looked up. "This is more than the position is worth. It's what I am willing to pay you." He signed. 46 candidates were still sitting in the staging hall downstairs when the elevator began its descent to take Caleb and Noah home for the day. Out in the 31st floor hallway, Derek Calloway pulled out a phone, not his work phone, and dialed a number stored in no directory belonging to Ardenvale. The line connected on the 2nd ring. "He's in," Derek said. He listened. "I know, I'll handle it." He listened again, longer this time. The call lasted 35 seconds. When it ended, Derek slid the phone back into his inside jacket pocket, smoothed the front of his suit, and walked toward his office with the careful, steady pace of a man who had just stepped onto a much thinner rope than he had been standing on 5 minutes earlier. The first 10 days passed in something close to silence. Caleb did not crowd. He did not announce himself. He stood when Sloane Whitfield moved through her own building, exactly 1.5 steps behind her left shoulder, close enough to put a hand on the door before she reached it, far enough to never be in the photograph. He read every room before she entered it. A heartbeat at the threshold, the eyes moving once around the perimeter, and then he stepped aside to let her cross. He could tell, from the way a man held his shoulders during a handshake, which board member was hiding bad numbers. He could feel in the way an assistant's smile tightened at the corners, which floor of the company had a leak. He never said any of it out loud. He simply made it easier for Sloane to walk through her days without being touched by anything she had not chosen to let in. It took her 4 days to find the word for what was strange about him. He did not stand near her because she was powerful. He stood near her because she was his responsibility. The distinction was so small and so unfamiliar that she turned it over in her mind for another 3 days before she accepted it as true. Every man who had ever worked in close protection at her side had carried a quiet performance with him, the awareness of being seen with her, the small calibrations of posture meant for the cameras and the room. Caleb did none of that. He was not standing there to be seen. He was standing there to keep something between her and whatever was coming. The 2 things she came to understand were not the same thing at all. On the afternoon of the 7th day, he knocked on her office door at 4:30. His phone had vibrated on his belt twice during the previous meeting, and she had watched him glance at it once and then put it back without breaking his step. Now he stood at the threshold of her office with the same composed face he wore through every meeting, and he asked her very quietly if he could leave 90 minutes early. "My son's after-school sitter was in a fender bender on the parkway. She's all right. She can't drive." Sloane was already pulling her glasses off. "Bring him here." Caleb hesitated at the doorway. "Mr. Merritt, bring him up. There is no reason that boys should sit in a hospital lobby for 90 minutes if there is a chair on the 32nd floor with his name on it." Noah arrived 20 minutes later, brought up by Madison with Scout under one arm and a small canvas backpack over the other shoulder. He greeted Sloane with the careful measuring courtesy of a child who had been raised to address strangers directly. He took the chair Madison gave him near the window. He pulled a tin of colored pencils out of his backpack, opened a notebook to a clean page, and drew for the entire afternoon without once asking for anything. Sloane took her 4 o'clock call, and her 4:30, and her 5:15 with the New York office. And through every one of them, the boy remained in the chair by the window, head bent over his notebook, the tip of his tongue pressed against his upper lip in concentration. When Caleb came in at 6 to collect him, Noah closed the notebook, slid it carefully into his backpack, and stood up. He walked to Sloane's desk before he left. He took a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out to her with both hands. "It's for you," he said. Sloane took it. She unfolded it on the desk after he was gone. 3 figures stood in front of a small house: a father, a son, and a woman in a long coat. The sky behind them was the color of a tangerine cut in half. The house had a single window and a door, and in the window, the boy had drawn very carefully a small bear. She held it for a long time. There was a paper recycling bin under her desk and a wastebasket near the door, and she walked past both of them. She slid the drawing into the top left drawer of her desk, the one where she kept the pen her father had given her the day she signed her first executive employment contract. She closed the drawer and sat at her desk and looked at the wall for a few seconds without seeing it. Then she picked up the next file in her stack and went back to work. The text came at 11 minutes past 11 that night. Sloane was alone in the penthouse in the half-dark of a single reading lamp with a glass of wine she had poured an hour ago and not touched. The number was withheld. The message was a single line. "You're being acquired, and you don't know it yet." A second message followed 3 seconds later. A photograph. A single page of a contract, photographed clearly enough that she could read every word. Section 11 of the joint venture agreement she had signed 8 months earlier with Veriton Capital, the firm run by a 65-year-old man named Raymond Ashford. The clause was buried inside the technical appendix under a header that referred only to procedural rights. She had not read it carefully when she signed. Her general counsel had told her it was boilerplate. She had trusted him. The clause was not boilerplate. She read it 3 times. By the 3rd reading, her hand was very still on the glass. She called her general counsel. He did not pick up. She called her deputy general counsel. He called back 50 minutes later, and the explanation he gave her was smooth, in a way that explanations were not supposed to be smooth. Every sentence closed the door on the next question. By the time she set the phone down, Sloane understood that the deputy was not on her side either, and possibly never had been. She lifted her eyes. Caleb was standing by the window. He had been there since she had ended the first call. She had not asked him to come. He had let himself in through the side entrance after Madison had radioed up that her boss had not gone to bed and was working through something. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his weight evenly distributed the city lights behind him, cutting his profile clean. "Do you know anything about this?" Sloane asked. "Not enough," Caleb said. "But I am looking." The dinner was the next evening at the Pinnacle Hotel, on the rotating restaurant on the 35th floor. Raymond Ashford had requested the meeting himself, framed as a quarterly check-in. He arrived in a charcoal suit and a tie the color of dried blood, and he greeted Sloane with the warmth of a man who had nothing to gain from charm, and was therefore offering it generously. He was tall and lean and silver-haired, the sort of man who had spent 40 years in rooms where the most dangerous thing he ever did was sign a piece of paper, and who carried that history in his hands. They ordered. They spoke about the markets, and about a mutual acquaintance in Chicago, and about the unseasonable warmth of the spring. Halfway through the entree between the 2nd and 3rd bite of his fish, Ashford said in the same tone with which he had ordered the wine, "Clause 11, of course, will become the natural balance point in the 1st quarter of next year." Sloane set her glass down on the white tablecloth. She did not let her hand return immediately to the stem. "I beg your pardon," Ashford smiled. "These things move at their own pace. You will find the transition feels quite organic. Veriton has always preferred a quiet hand on the rudder." He returned to his fish. The rest of the dinner was conversation, but Sloane no longer heard most of it. She watched Ashford's hands cut his fish and refill her water, and she registered with the cold attention of someone learning the shape of a knife in the dark that this man had walked into her quarter, believing he had already won it. Caleb drove her home. He drove the way he did everything with the unwasted, deliberate economy of a man who knew exactly how much room he had on every side. They were 6 blocks from her building when he spoke. Clause 11 gives Veritan supermajority voting rights in the event of any board-level deadlock, he said quietly. Clause 17 lets them call that deadlock by submitting a written objection to any agenda item with a 48-hour notice. Appendix D defines what counts as agenda. The definition is wide enough to drive a truck through. Sloane looked at him. "You read my contract," she said, "on the first morning, before you came in. All 140 pages. I can't protect you if I don't understand the ground you are standing on." She turned her face toward the passenger window and watched the city slide by in panes of light. She could see his reflection in the glass. The line of his jaw was holding a tension she had not seen at any point during the dinner. He had performed calm at that table just as carefully as she had, and he had done it for her. The realization sank into her chest and did not lift. The basement camera log went missing on the morning of the 12th day. Caleb caught it on the routine review he ran every morning at 6, a habit no one had asked him to keep. There was a 9-minute window in the parking level surveillance feed where the timestamp continued to run, but the image stream simply did not exist. No error code, no automatic reboot log, no technical note from the overnight shift. The kind of gap a person made who knew exactly how the system was monitored and exactly which fields its alarms watched. He pulled the badge access record for the same window. 3 swipes. One belonged to the building janitor who had been logged into the freight elevator at the same time. One belonged to a contractor whose entry was authorized. The third belonged to Derek Calloway. Derek had been off the clock that night. Caleb pulled Derek's recent phone log, which a man in his position was not supposed to be able to access without a warrant. There was a number in it he did not recognize, and the call had lasted 35 seconds, and it had taken place 40 minutes after he had walked out of Sloane's office on the day of the tryout. He filed the information in the same quiet place he filed everything else. The fever came on the 14th night. Noah had been quiet all afternoon at the after-school program. By 6, when Caleb arrived to pick him up, his cheeks were too pink and his eyes were too bright, and he had let his teacher take Scout and hold him for the last hour, which was a thing he never did unless he was sick. Caleb laid the back of his hand against the boy's forehead, then his cheek, and he did not need a thermometer to know the number. Noah's temperature was up over 101.3. Caleb drove home, gave him a quarter dose of children's ibuprofen, and made him toast. Then he picked up his phone to text Sloane that he would be in late the following morning, and his phone vibrated in his hand before he had finished the message. It was Sloane. 2 words. "I'm coming." He started to type the polite version of no. His thumb stopped over the screen. He sent the address instead. She arrived 25 minutes later in a long gray coat and sneakers, which was the first time Caleb had ever seen her in anything that was not built for a boardroom. She stood in his doorway and looked past him at the boy on the couch under a blanket, and the careful authority that ran her every working hour was nowhere on her face. "You don't have to—" "I know," Sloane said. She came in. The apartment was small and clean and lived in. The kitchen was on the right. The living room ran along the windows on the left. And in the corner of the living room between the window and the radiator was a space that belonged entirely to Noah. The wall above it was covered in his drawings, taped up in slightly crooked rows. The bookshelf next to it was sorted by the color of the spines, blues with blues, reds with reds. The toy basket beside the bookshelf had its own private order that only the boy understood. It was the corner of a child whose father had decided deliberately to give him a kingdom inside the small territory they shared. Sloane stood in the entryway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, the way a person hangs a coat in a place where she has already been welcomed. Noah fell asleep at 9:30. Caleb tucked the blanket up to his chin and turned off the lamp on the side table. He came back into the kitchen where Sloane was sitting at the small wooden table with a cup of tea she had made herself. He sat down across from her. After a while, she asked about Noah's mother. Caleb did not answer right away. The kitchen clock ticked, then he told her. Her name was Renee. They had married young. She had been driving home on Interstate 5 in the rain 4 years ago when a semi had jackknifed in front of her in the dark. She had died on impact. Noah had been 13 months old. Caleb had been in Afghanistan. He had come home in 72 hours. He had filed his discharge paperwork in 45 days. He had not gone back. He did not look at Sloane while he told her. He looked at the grain of the table. She did not say, "I am sorry." She did not reach for his hand. She sat with the silence of those numbers, and she let them be what they were, and after a long moment, she lifted her eyes to his. "Is that why you always stand exactly 1.5 steps behind Hawa?" For the first time since she had met him, the face Caleb wore in his working hours was not the face she was looking at. He looked at her across the small kitchen table, and he was not in that second anyone's bodyguard. "Yes," he said. The investigator's report came back on the evening of the 15th day. Sloane had asked her personal investigator, not Ardenvale's, not anyone Derek could touch, to trace the phone number on the inside of the white envelope Caleb had handed to the intake officer on the day of the tryout. The number rang to a small cabin in the Cascades. The cabin belonged to a retired Army colonel named Warren Schaefer. Schaefer had been Caleb's direct commanding officer for the last 3 years of his service. Schaefer was the man who had sent the dossier to Sloane's desk. Schaefer had known about Raymond Ashford and Veriton Capital before Sloane had. She sat alone in her dark office with the report in her lap. The skyline of Seattle burned in the window behind her, and she did not see it. She understood in a way she had not understood the night the text came in the actual shape of the thing she was inside. "I have been surrounded," she said to no one, "since before the game started." She closed the folder. She picked up her phone and walked out of the office to find Caleb. The shareholder meeting was called for 48 hours from that moment. The notice came from Raymond Ashford's office, citing concerns about fourth quarter performance framed in the soft language of fiduciary diligence. Sloane and Caleb both knew by the time they had read it twice what the meeting actually was. Caleb spent the next 48 hours doing the only thing he knew how to do. He walked the building. By the second night, he had found 3 things. 2 service elevators on the freight side of the tower had been accessed in the off hours, with maintenance badges that were not registered to any employee in Ardenvale's payroll. 4 outside guests had been pre-cleared for the day of the meeting under the name of a consulting firm that did not appear in any vendor database the company had used in the past 6 years. And the motion sensors on the east hallway of the 32nd floor had a specific 8-second window where they recorded a presence and then went dark, not bypassed, but actively disabled by a hand that knew exactly which sensor to silence. The east hallway of the 32nd floor led to one room, the core server vault. Inside it sat the encrypted data of more than 1,200 enterprise clients. Caleb stood in front of the camera feed at 3 in the morning on the day of the meeting with a paper coffee cup cooling beside him, and he did the math one more time. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. The breach window working backward from the cleared guest list and the disabled sensor pattern would open at 9:15 and close at 9:50. He had 35 minutes. He picked up his phone and sent 2 words to Sloane. "It is today." Sloane's reply came back in 11 seconds. 1 word. "Go." Caleb did not take the elevator. He took the north stairwell 2 steps at a time. The fire door on the 32nd floor opened onto an east hallway. He had walked 20 times since he had taken the job, and he stepped through it into the silence of a floor that was supposed to be cleared, but as he could already feel in the weight of the air was not empty. There were 5 of them. They were moving toward the door of the core server vault, with the unhurried confidence of men who had been told a hallway would be empty. The man at the front carried a slim black hardshell case the size of a laptop bag. The 2 behind him carried nothing visible. The 4th hung back to cover the corridor. The 5th, the largest, was 3 paces ahead, leading them in. Caleb stepped out of the stairwell. The first man saw him. The second saw him a half-second later. Neither reached for the obvious. Caleb did not give them time to reach for anything else. The first one went down on the angle of his own forward step, his weight already committed past the point of recovery, before he understood he was being engaged. The second turned his shoulder into the strike. Caleb had not yet thrown, and into the strike he did throw, which arrived from a direction the man's training had told him to ignore. 2 seconds, 2 on the floor, the third reoriented faster than the others. He came in low and well, the way someone who had spent years being good at this came in. He almost connected. Caleb let him almost connect, took the man's momentum and put it through the wall. The 4th came from the right. Caleb had already read that attack from the moment he registered the formation. He stepped inside the man's reach, took the elbow that came swinging at temple height on his raised forearm, and felt the shock of it land along his right shoulder. Not a break, but something there that had not been there a moment before. He filed it away and finished the engagement before the man's other hand could come up. The 5th was the largest, and the largest was the one who had been trained for this exact kind of work. He took 14 seconds. Caleb was breathing harder when it was over, but only just. He stepped over the last man and turned toward the server vault. Derek Calloway stepped out of an alcove on the east side of the hallway with a service pistol in his hand. He held it the way a man trained on a range holds a weapon. His face was very calm. There was a thin layer of perspiration along his hairline, and nowhere else. "I need 20 minutes, Derek said. "Stand still. Nobody else gets hurt." Caleb looked at him across 10 feet of empty hallway. "I don't have 20 minutes. "Caleb, walk away. You don't even know what's in there. I know enough." Derek's finger sat outside the trigger guard, which was the last useful piece of information Caleb needed. "What did they offer you?" Caleb asked. Derek smiled, the tired smile of a man who had stopped believing in the version of his life he had been living. "Enough to walk out of this building and never need to walk back in. Enough that my daughter does not end up where I came from." "You know what comes after the 20 minutes? Caleb said. "You know what they do to the man who let them in." The smile faded a degree. It was enough. Caleb closed the distance in 3 steps. Derek was good. Derek had been good for a long time. But Derek was acting on the logic of intimidation, and Caleb was acting on the logic of necessity, and necessity had its own advantages in narrow spaces. The pistol came up. Caleb's left hand was already on the slide before the muzzle reached chest height. The disarm was clean. The follow-through was cleaner. 2 seconds after Caleb closed the distance, Derek was on the floor with one wrist locked behind his shoulder blade and his cheek pressed against the carpet, and the pistol was sitting against the baseboard 6 feet away. Building security came up the stairwell 90 seconds later. By the time they arrived, Derek was sitting against the wall, with his hands cuffed behind his back, and the look on his face of a man who had just realized which side of the bet he had placed himself on. 1 floor below in the boardroom, Raymond Ashford was 3 minutes into the speech he had been preparing for 8 months. He stood at the head of the long oval table, his hands light on the back of the chair, his voice carrying the slow register of a man who believed this was inevitable. 28 shareholders sat around the table. Sloane sat at the far end. Her face was the face she had brought into every difficult quarter of the last 6 years, and Ashford did not look closely enough to see that it was not the face she was wearing. In her left ear, an earpiece the size of a pencil tip sat under her hair. Madison's voice came through at 90 seconds before Ashford was due to finish his closing. "He's in. They have all 5. Derek is in custody. Police are on the elevator." Sloane did not move. She let Ashford finish his sentence. Then she let him finish the next one. She let him reach the end of his prepared remarks and set his hands flat on the back of the chair. And only then, when the room was quiet and waiting for him to invite her response, did she lift her eyes from the table and look at him. "This meeting will be postponed," she said. "The reasons will be clarified by law enforcement in the next several minutes." A small noise ran around the table, the sound of 28 people inhaling at slightly different rates. Ashford's expression did not change, but his hands did. Sloane stood up. "Clause 11. She said, "will be challenged under Section 19C of the Joint Venture Agreement. Invalidation in the case of demonstrated fraud on the part of a partner. I have the evidence. I have been collecting it for 10 days. Ashford sat in the kind of silence a man sits in when the floor under his feet has been removed, and the only thing keeping him upright is the table he has been resting his hands on. The doors at the far end of the boardroom opened. 2 officers in plain dark jackets walked in. Sloane found Caleb in the lobby on the first floor 20 minutes later, with the police still working the upper hallway. He was sitting on a bench by the security desk, holding his right arm against his side, in a way she had not seen him hold any part of his body before. She looked at the shoulder. She looked at the line of dark fabric along his right forearm where the sleeve had torn, and the cloth had stopped being only cloth. "I drive," Sloane said. Caleb opened his mouth. She held up the keys. He did not finish the sentence. At the emergency room registration window, the intake nurse asked him for his insurance information. Sloane recited it from memory before he had finished reaching for his wallet. "Provider group number policy, number last 4 of his social." The nurse looked up from the screen, looked at Sloane, looked at Caleb, and looked back at her keyboard, without making any assumptions out loud. "Personnel file," Sloane said quietly to Caleb as they walked toward the curtained bay. "I read it the weekend after I signed your contract. You read all of them that carefully." "No." In the curtained bay while they waited for a doctor, Sloane opened a drawer in the supply cart and took out a square of gauze and a roll of medical tape. She sat down on the rolling stool next to the bed and reached for his arm without asking. "You know how to do that," Caleb said. "No, but I learned fast." He watched her work. She was neat about it the way she was neat about everything. He did not stop her. Madison brought Noah in 40 minutes later. The after-school sitter had not picked up the phone. Madison had collected the boy herself, Scout under his arm, and driven him to the hospital in her own car. Noah came into the room in 4 small steps and walked directly to the side of Caleb's bed. He took his father's good hand, in both of his, and held it without saying anything. The quiet said more than any words a 5-year-old could have put together. After a moment, the boy turned his head and looked at Sloane with the careful weighing look of a child working out an important question. "Is Miss Whitfield the reason Dad got hurt?" The room went still. Caleb looked at his son. "No, Bud. Dad got hurt because of what Dad's job needed Dad to do today." Noah considered this for a few seconds. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he had decided to believe something. Then he looked back at Sloane with the same measuring weight, and whatever he had been looking for, he must have found it, because his shoulders eased a 1/4 of an inch. "Can you stay?" he asked her. "I don't want Dad to be alone when he is hurt." Sloane glanced at Caleb. He was looking at a point on the wall above the bed, with the focused stillness of a man who had decided to study the paint very carefully for a while. She pulled her chair an inch closer to the bed. "Yes," she said. Derek Calloway and Raymond Ashford were processed by federal authorities. Clause 11 was voided. Veriton sold its Ardenvale position at a forced loss. The data of 1,200 enterprise clients remained untouched. Midnight came quietly to the hospital hallway. Noah had fallen asleep on a waiting bench outside the discharge area, his knees pulled up onto Sloane's folded coat, Scout tucked between his chin and his chest, in the safe place where the bear had always lived. Sloane sat without moving on the bench, her hand resting on the edge of the cushion just beside the boy's shoulder, not touching him, but close enough that if he stirred, she would know. Caleb stood at the door of the room. He had been cleared to leave 40 minutes earlier. He had not left. He looked at the two of them in the yellow hum of the corridor light, and he did not speak. After a long while, he came out of the doorway and crossed the corridor and sat down on the bench on the other side of his sleeping son. The boy was now between two adults, with the bear in the middle. Sloane spoke first quietly enough that only he heard. Noah added to the drawing. He waited. The one he gave me last week. He came into my office this morning before I arrived and put something in. What did he add? A swing set, she said. In front of the house. Caleb did not answer right away. The corridor light hummed in its even indifferent way above them. Noah breathed the steady, untroubled rhythm of a child who somewhere in the part of himself that did not need to be told had decided that the world around him was being held, for the first time in that long, heavy day, and perhaps for the first time in a much longer stretch of time than that, the corner of Caleb Merritt's mouth lifted. Small, quiet, but unmistakable. It was a beginning.